Good evening, church. Welcome to Recovering Grace. This is our fourth class tonight. Well, actually, we're on step 4, made a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. And we're going to be discussing that at length this evening, try to give you an understanding, at least a basic understanding of what this step is all about. Now, a lot of people have told me that they have a great amount of problems and difficulties with step 4. In fact, it's common in the AA community for people to drop out of the program when they get to step 4. In other words, they do the first 3 steps. They admit that they're powerless and their life is unmanageable, and they even come to believe, and I think probably with a genuine faith, that God can restore them to sanity. The power greater than themselves can actually restore them. And they are willing to turn their life and their will over to the care of God as they understand Him. But then, as the Big Book says, you've got to put it into action here. It kind of reminds me of how the authors of the Big Book were impacted by the book of James, in which James suggests that we really are not exercising faith unless it's followed by works. In other words, you can't divorce faith from works or behavior because faith prompts the works. So that's a whole nother discussion I'm not going to get into with you tonight. But the point is that the Big Book says we need to get down to business here. And the business they're talking about is dealing with all of the issues that have been conditioned into us our entire lives that produces the symptom, they call it actually a symptom of alcoholism. In other words, they say our drinking wasn't really the problem. And you can see that kind of practically with folks who have quit drinking. They've engaged in abstinence. And they may attend meetings and they may go about their routine without any alcohol at all, and yet deep within them are still character defects, shortcomings that unfortunately make them mean snakes. So dealing with our roots and the root issues that produce the addiction in the first place is really what the fourth step begins to describe for us. And I want to emphasize here, the fourth step is not a be-all and end-all step. It is just part of the 12 steps, and it is a beginning on how it is we deal with those roots in our personality that have been conditioned into us that has led us to some sort of abusive behavior, self-abusive behavior like addiction. And so the fourth step itself, it just says we made a searching and fearless moral inventory. Now, obviously, that requires the same honesty as was required to do step 1. But now we're looking at ourselves honestly. Now, in order to help you with that, I'm going to give you an overview tonight of what the scriptures actually tell us that happens to us in those first 3 steps. Jesus called the first 3 steps, of course, they weren't around in his day, but what they lead up to is what Jesus referred to as being born again. And he told Nicodemus, you've got to be born again before any of this stuff will make sense to you. Well, really, being born again is equivalent to doing the first 3 steps. But what does that mean to be born again? The simplest way I can put it to you is you're no longer the same person you've always thought you were. You see, spiritually, something dramatic happens to you. And because AA is a spiritual program, and they talk about the need for spiritual healing, I want to mention this to you so that you understand where they're coming from. Spiritually, when you do those first 3 steps, you're no longer the same person that you've always thought you were. No, the scriptures are real clear about that. By your simple, genuine faith, childlike faith in God doing for you what you couldn't do for yourself. You have been what Jesus called born again. That means you have become a brand new person. Now, I'm not going to go into all the details of that tonight. You can look this up if you want to. If you want to study a little more about it, you can look it up in Romans chapters 6 and 7 and 8. You can look up those chapters and read about what it means to become born again. Because in those chapters, he says that when you trusted Jesus, the person that you always thought you were, that old person with all the character defects we're going to be looking at and all the conditioning, all the coping strategies that you've had conditioned into you, that old person actually was crucified spiritually with Christ on the cross when he died, buried with him. And when Christ rose again from the dead, God raised up you as a brand new person that shares in the righteous life of Christ. And so this marvelous transition we call our union with Christ, being born again, is the power that's going to be necessary for you to be able to do a searching and fearless moral inventory. So let me try to get it down as simply as I can to you. If you try to do the fourth step, refusing to believe that you're a new person, then you're going to try to cover up those character defects. You're going to try to cover up your faults, your resentments, your fears, all of the things that have been nagging at you and destroying your life up to this point, simply because you think we're talking about you. You think we're talking about the person you are now. But you understand the gospel. The good news means you're no longer that same person. Now, it doesn't mean that you don't have to deal with those character defects and issues, because even though you yourself was born again as a brand new person, you still live in the same old body you were born with. And in that same old physical body is the presence of what the Bible refers to as the flesh, which is the sum total of all of your conditioning, the sum total of all your coping strategies, all your fears, all your resentments, all your emotions, all your memories, all that stuff is still stored in your memory in virtually every cell of this physical body you inhabit. So here's the issue we've got. We've got a brand new person now who has done the first three steps, living in the same old body you were born with and acted out in. The difference is that new person living in that body is no longer capable of dealing with that flesh. Only God can help you deal with that flesh. This is why the emphasis in the steps is on God doing for you what you can't do for yourself. Now, the first thing he's going to do for you is to help you do the fourth step, help you get honest and real about your resentments, your character defects, the things that you've done that you're ashamed of, that lead to all kinds of guilt and that sort of thing. He's going to help you identify those things, knowing that that's not the new person you are, but the old person that you were that did those things. And then on top of that, he's going to go on and remove those character defects and remove those fleshly traps as we identify them later in step 7, when we humbly ask him to remove that trash from our lives. So the fourth step is not something to be feared, even though it creates an image in our mind that we've got to be honest about things we've been trying to hide all our lives, we've been ashamed of, we haven't wanted anybody to know about it, not God or anybody else. And there's a fear that arises naturally within us when we think about doing that kind of activity. However, if we realize that we are a brand new person that is no longer responsible for those old activities, because Those old activities were done by the person you used to be. So God does not hold you responsible for that. He has forgiven you. He has cleansed you. He has given you a completely new identity in Christ. That's what we have to hang on to when we begin to deal with this residual flesh that yet lives in this body of ours. Now, I know it's a little bit confusing, and I know it's a little difficult, but here's the bottom line for me, and I hope for you. That is, because of the gospel, because of the good news of who God has made you to be, simply on the basis of your faith in Him alone, you are no longer the same person you've always thought you were. You're no longer that person. You are a brand new person now. Now, in order to deal with the leftover baggage of that old person you were, you're going to have to believe that you're a brand new person so that you can enter into this searching moral inventory with faith and courage. You see, it not only takes honesty, it takes courage to look at this stuff. It takes courage to look at what has happened throughout your lifetime as the old person you were and allow God to deal with that, to clean it up. So you're not going into the fourth step alone. You're going into the fourth step with God as your Father, having forgiven you of all sins and trespasses. You're going in to look at that mess that yet resides in this physical body with Him under His leadership and through His power to deal with that so that you can live out the reality of the new person you are. Now, I know that's a very quick and very general statement concerning of the gospel to your life before the fourth step, but I trust that you'll take that as an encouragement. I shared with the panel before we came on the air tonight, I shared with them that I have two audiences in mind here that I want to bring the same point home to. The first audience, obviously, are those folks who are seeking recovery from substance abuse or any other addiction in their life. They're seeking recovery and they're looking to the power of the principles of the 12 steps to help them. The second audience, however, is equally in need of recovery, and that audience is the recovering Pharisee. Myself, I was a recovering Pharisee. I am a recovery Pharisee. I was born a Pharisee of Pharisees. I think I was born on a church pew. My daddy was a preacher. And I grew up under the law in a Pharisee kind of environment. I went to Pharisee school and graduated with honors and master's program of how to be a Pharisee. And I thought it was my job to go make other Pharisees. Well, I had to come to grips with my own character defects. I had to come to grips with my own sins, my own transgressions, my own shortcomings, just as surely as any drug addict or alcoholic has to come to grips with it. At the time I did it, I didn't really call it a fourth step, although later I learned that's exactly what I did. I got real with God about my character, my sins, my hidden agendas, and that sort of thing. And as a recovering Pharisee, now I can see the need for the fourth step. But note, it's only the beginning. It's just the beginning. The first time you do a fourth step, it's just the beginning of having God cleanse you, having Him actually take away and remove all that baggage we've been carrying. So at this point, I'm going to bring in the panel now. I want them to comment on the various experiences they've had with the fourth step and how they viewed the fourth step throughout their lifetime as it's been going. So let's start first of all with the lady on the panel, Pam. Yeah, she's got some interesting stuff she wants to share with you tonight about the fourth step from a book, very, very excellent book. She'll tell you about it, called Breathing Underwater. And so, Pam, we'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, John. We have discussed this book in this venue before, and God put it on my heart this morning to pull it back out and read about the fourth step in it. And one of the points that he made in that book about the fourth step was that basically a fourth step is doing exactly what we're admonished in Matthew 7, 4 and 5, and that is it's a process of taking the log out of our own eyes. And it's an actual means of going about doing that. I don't know about anybody else, but a lot of times when I read things in the Bible, I'm like, what do you mean? How do I do that? What does that mean? Take the log out of my own eye. It's a great, picture, but I have no clue how to do it. One of the things that I think it's important to recognize is that if I'm taking the log out of my own eye, unless it's a really small log, I'm going to need help. I'm not going to be able to remove that log from my eye by myself. And I know for me, one of the most powerful parts of doing a fourth step was the humility, the desperation that I felt for making a change in my life, that I was truly willing to go to any length. I didn't care. I had to change. I had to change. And so whatever person you acquire, obviously in a 12-step program, we have things that are called sponsors. Some people have mentors, whatever word you want to use for the person. I think one of the most important things is finding somebody who has done it, and then they are qualified to help you. I'm not sure it matters as much how we do it as it does that we actually enter into the process of asking for help. That for me, it was that humility, that busting of my pride that just said, I don't care anymore. I don't care. I have to have change. One of the other things that Richard Rohr said about the fourth step was, he said, let me see if I can get it. Seeing and naming our actual faults is probably not so much a gift to us, although it is a gift to us, as it is a gift to those around us. We must try and make ourselves easier for others to love. Wow. Wow. We must make ourselves easier for other people to love. And when I enter into that process of getting honest and real about my flesh and my character defects, I know because of the way I did my fourth step, it was very fearless, thorough, searching. I wrote the great American novel. But I came away from that experience with a pretty clear picture, not just of what they were, but what I call my MO, my method of operation. When people cops are like looking for bank robbers, they have a list. They know how the caper was done, and they have a list of the criminals who like to do it that way. And so it may not have been one of them, but that's who they go look at first, were the ones that they know like to do it that way. Well, in my case, when I am jammed up, when I am in a resentment, when I've got trouble, and I go to my sponsor with it, and she explains to me that basically I'm doing something that I identified on my fourth step was the way I operate. I'll give you an example. One of my big character defects is I like to be responsible for things I have no power over. It makes me feel important. And so when I try and take responsibility for things I have no power over, I get extremely frustrated. And when the things I'm trying to have power over don't respond to the things that I am trying to do for it or them, I start hating them. Well, I know I do that. I know I do that. So when my sponsor says, it sounds to me like you're trying to be responsible for something you have no power over, my immediate response, of course, is no, that's not what I'm doing. You just don't understand. But after I get off the phone and I think about it a little while, I'm like, you know what? I tend to do that. Maybe she's right. And that process opens the door for me to move forward in making changes in my life. I'm going to shut up now and let somebody else talk. Thank you.
Thanks, Pam. You know, one of the things we're talking about, and this is a good place to introduce it, is what I call the trip in. And that trip in is to just very briefly to look at our circumstances, our situations, and then look at the behavior, how we acted in that situation, then look at the emotions that were driving our behavior, and finally come down to the lies we were believing about ourselves that produced the emotions that drove the behavior. And when we get down to that point, we can actually transfer over to the truth that counters that lie, which will produce a change. And we'll talk more about that trip in later on. But the fourth step is a good example of that, the necessary process. And that needed. And I loved your connection with Jesus telling us to get the telephone pole out of our own eye before we try to take the splinter out of our brother's eye here. So let's jump down to David. David, what particularly did you find the hardest about a fourth step for you personally?
Well, personally, number one, I really liked what you shared, John, in reference to our identity. Before I understood anything about identity, trying to do a fourth step was very difficult for me because I had a tremendous amount of fears and tremendous amount of regret. Hello, for things that I did while drinking, drugging, the lifestyle that I lived. I had a lot of shame, and so it was difficult for me at first, before understanding identity, the Alpha series, who we are, who God's made us to be. It was very difficult to look at that and understand. You know, I recoiled from it. I was ashamed and didn't. But once I started learning about my identity and understood that is the old person, then it became easier for me to work that step. I have worked that step multiple times in my past 30 something years. And I had mixed results because of, number one, my own denial and my own depth of addiction that I had in my thinking. It was you know, I was trying to be perfect in how I did it. I was trying to understand, and looking at the book and reading the book and working with the sponsor, as Pam indicated. And it came down to the fact that I just finally had to do it the way the sponsor told me to do it, because I was trying to do it perfectly. I was trying to do a perfect resentment list, fear list, and then harms done others, kind of as the book lays it out. And I was just dragging it on, procrastinating. So finally, I just did it when my sponsor told me to do it. And, you know, I did get results from it. Changes started occurring from it. I was but later on, I had a relapse, so I did it again. So that's my experience with it, but it has made major changes in the way I understand myself and believe. So I'll just leave it at that at this point. Thank you.
All right, thank you, David. I know that, again, one of the things we want to emphasize is this is something that's done over and over again. I find that the quicker we do it, or the sooner we do it, the easier it becomes to do it. And as we share with others, the easier it is for them. Like, I love what Roar said there, Pam. The easier it is, making it easier for them to love us. Who doesn't want to? So, all right. How about from the Pharisee point of view? Now, I don't know which to go with, the guy with the hat on or the bald-headed Pharisee, but I know these guys have some Pharisaical roots in them. And so, who wants to start? Tom, you want to go?
All right. Well, since Bill isn't brave enough, I'm just kidding you, Bill. Just one thought following up on what Dave was saying. Death is not something, perfection is not something that can be attained in a fourth step. And that's why there's a 10th step. The 10th step is we continue to take inventory, and when we're wrong, we promptly admit it. So it becomes a lifestyle that I'm not saying you get a pass on the fourth step. I'm just saying that the idea of perfection is get that out of your head. John, you mentioned, the born again experience, and I know you've said many times that part of the new person that we are, or that God has made us to be in Christ, not only has a brand new future, but also has a brand new past. And the big book says that, regarding taking inventory, it compares it to business. And I found this to be very true, that the business that doesn't take regular inventories typically goes bust, typically goes out of business. So inventory is very important. And the connection that I'm trying to make in that is that we tend to drag around a bunch of stuff through life that we don't need anymore. For example, coping strategies to try to make us feel better, or to try to reassure us of our worth. And because of the new person Christ has made us to be, we no longer need that stuff. Now, when you take an inventory in a business, it's not the most fun job in the world. It's laborious. It's tedious. But the better you do, the better effort you put into it, the better the result. And I've spent many New Year's Eves, doing inventory counts, and it's rather boring, but you tend to find out a whole lot of stuff there that, it's obsolete merchandise. You don't need it anymore. It's really of no value. It's of no worth. So the best thing you can do is throw it out and get rid of it. Now, that sounds pretty easy, but sometimes I have a tendency I tend to be a little bit of a pack rat, and I'll say, well, you know what? I might need that at some point. And I remember back in 1984, when I really needed one of these and I couldn't find one, so I bought one in 1984 and I still haven't used it since. It's, and I'm not trying to make light of it. I'm just trying to say that we tend to drag a lot of stuff through life that we just don't need anymore. So that's the connection with having not only a brand new future, but a brand new path. And finally, I will say, regarding into action, which is what the term of the big book has a whole chapter regarding the 4 steps into action, is that, as John pointed out, action is the result of faith. And what will block us is what is the opposite of faith, is fear. Fear will paralyze us from taking action. And, and as Dave and Pam both pointed out, there's a lot of fear when you start taking this inventory. But faith is going to be what's required to actually do a really thorough inventory, or to at least have the desire to do a thorough inventory. Because on your own power, you really can't do, and you're going to require the intervention of the Holy Spirit to lead you and guide you and help you in taking this inventory. So with that said, I'll pass it over to the other Pharisee.
All right.
All right, Bill, I think you're up.
Oh, I thought he meant you, John.
Mhm.
Well, I got to tell you, I am a card-holding member of Pharisees Anonymous. I remember a few years back, I wanted to start my own Facebook page called Pharisees Anonymous, and a couple gentlemen saw it and they said, "Hey, we have a page called that," and I kind of got together with them. So that's a real deal. I remember Martin French talking to him and asking him about the term dry drunk. And he said, "Bill," he goes, "just picture a guy sitting with a beer in his hand, watching the news and cussing everybody out and talking about how everything's wrong in the world and how all those people are wrong and going on and on about it." He goes, "Now, get another guy, just take the beer out of his hand and put a Bible in his hand, and he's doing the same thing, pointing out everything that's wrong, how screwed up everyone else is. I'm right, you're wrong. There's nothing wrong with me. Everything's wrong with you." He goes, "There's your dry drunk." And I thought that guy, the second guy, sounded kind of familiar. I didn't say I resent that remark. I said I resemble that remark. And so that was my experience. The beautiful thing is that the Holy Spirit's always teaching us. And I wasn't a good Pharisee. You know, when I became a Christian, kind of out of a just very licentious, agnostic background, I wasn't a good Pharisee. So that's the good thing about it. My religious performance was horrible. So when I came and I first heard the Alpha series, it was really learning and only just knowing enough of my new identity in Christ, knowing enough that my needs were met, that really helped me go through the steps. Now, my experience was there were a lot of recovery people in our fellowship. There was at Family Worship Center, and John was teaching over here, Grace Place, and a couple other places back in the 1900s. So and so the fellowship, the people that were kind of fellowshipping and gathering around John's message, the Alpha series, there were people in recovery, and I would listen to them talk, and they had something that I wanted. So one of the guys that would come to all the Alpha series, his name was Billy Precious. I said, you know, this is. I asked him if I could do the steps, and what I realize now, even through recently reading Breathe Underwater, is that we're all addicted. I was dealing with my own codependence. I was married to an adult child of an alcoholic. I was functional all the way around, codependency, sexual dysfunction, and I said, I want to go through this. And so when we got to step 4, he said to me, he goes, "Now for you," he goes, "I want you to do a resentment list." He goes, "I want you to," I said, you know, I was kind of pushing back on it. And when I heard him describe what it was, my attitude was like, "Listen, I'm a nice guy, Bill. I don't have any resentments. You know, I don't hate anybody." And so he kind of kept at it, and he's an Irishman. He kind of leaned forward and he said, "Listen to me. I want to tell you something. Nice is overrated." It was peppered with some language too. And he says, "Listen, you're fired," and that's the term I think the AA used. "I'm going to fire you if you don't do this." So I kind of still was honoring, and then he said, "Listen, go home, sit down with the Lord," and he gave me like a little diagram, who I'm resenting, why, my part in it, what God would do. That's how he laid it out for me. He said, "Go home, pray, ask the Lord, be completely honest with him, open to what he's going to show you." And I'll tell you what, I had 4 or 5 pages later of me writing down resentment and bitterness, really getting honest about my hatred was, I mean, it was really life-changing. That was a life-changing event for me. That step was when I came and did the fifth step we'll talk about next week. It was really like I didn't realize, you know. And the pattern in my family was to deny the hatred, deny the anger, and then sooner or later someone was going to blow up in fits of rage, you know. And then, but then after that fit of rage and the kind of the physical or the emotional abuse, there was always like these feelings of guilt and, you know, I mean, somewhat forgiveness that we extend to each other, but it was always swept under the rug, and it wasn't like this is how you relate. It's not how you communicate. And I grew up with I feel like my dad's generation were these men that they didn't know how to process or deal with anger or hatred, you know. And it just came out, and I think really what really helped me was John had taught the trip in his class. John would do, you know, on the chapter on emotions, where you pluck out your eye and you take off your hand. When John was talking about being honest about the hatred, when I sat there listening to John say that in the class, I was like, yeah, man, people have to be honest about their hatred. You know, hate destroy you. Yeah, I see it all the time. Thank God I know Jesus, that I don't see anybody and all that. When I got to this step and Billy was pushing it, right? And it really, really helped me go through it. And I had this diagram that I use on the Pharisees, is that the new person that we are is going to take a look at your flesh. And those that understand, have been taught identity, taught that understand what flesh is. What gives us the courage, what helps us overcome that fear about being honesty and really looking at the dead man's bones, the rot that is in there, is understanding that that's not how God sees it. There's this brand new person that He's made you. He's growing you with grace and knowledge. Let's take a look at the worst enemy. That is nothing compared to your flesh. World system, flesh, and all that. Let's take a look at it and be completely honest. And the thing that gave me the courage, anyway, is knowing that God did not identify me with that flesh. So that really, really, that helped me more than any part. Those two things coming together, the chapter on emotions and really being open and honest, doing that moral inventory, really was life changing for me. And but what I would really encourage is an everyday thing. That's where step 10 comes in. We'll talk about that later. And the other thing I want to just bring up real quick, John talked about doing the trip in. I would use this graph. This is education. They call it a graphic organizer. I would use this all the time to work out when I was really, really angry and frustrated and hating. I would use this and as a graphic organizer. Now, last Thursday, Tom and I touched on this, and we were talking about it, and I was bragging about how I don't need that graphic organizer anymore. I can just do it in my head, deal with my resentments, blah, blah, blah. Well, guess what? Last week, a week ago Monday, I blew up at everybody, and I had to go back over it and really deal with stuff that I hadn't been dealing with. I thought I arrived. I don't know. But this fearless thing is not fear. Okay? God's going to show you God has you. You're secure, significant, and you can take an honest look. And I'm going to, I really like this. This is not that one. This one. You cannot heal what you do not first acknowledge. And that's from the book Breathing Underwater. And it'll set you free. Jesus will set you free through this whole process. I'll throw it back to John.
All right, thank you, Bill. I want to ask the panel one closing question here, because you brought it up, and in fact, all of us have probably mentioned it one way or another. We've all talked about resentments, which is kind of a polite way of saying, talk about hate. Okay? And here's the question. From your experience, how comfortable are people talking about hate, talking about their own hatred? I've known folks, I've been counseling for 40 years, different folks, pastoral counseling, and invariably they say, no, I don't hate that person. I just, they hurt me 20 years ago, but I don't hate him. I've just been mad at him for years. Well, in the Alpha series, I emphasize the point that we've got about maybe 30 seconds from when we get angry because somebody has disappointed us or hurt us in some way, let us down, it made us mad, we got angry. We've got about 30 seconds to start believing the truth about who God has made us to be so that we can let it go, or it's going to turn into hatred. And that hatred, when it's suppressed, when it's pushed down, and it's that baggage that we carry with us all the time, when it's pushed down, it takes a lot of mental energy to hold that hatred down to keep it from bubbling up. So I just want you guys to touch on some of your experiences about the difficulty in dealing with that hatred. The big book says resentment is our number one offender. Okay, and it just narrows it down to learning to deal with hatred. And what it really means to me is identifying what it really is. And that's the power to me for the fourth step. So, Dan, let's start with you, and we'll just go right around the room.
Okay. So in the attempt to represent all sides here, I was born, I lived until you led me to the Lord 27 years ago. I lived what I called an amoral life. My understanding is to be immoral, you have to have morals. And I didn't have any. So when it came to hatred, I did not have any of the religious hang-ups about hating people. The problem that I had when it came to doing the fourth step in dealing with my resentment was, by God, they were justified. Okay? I had a right to them. And the hard part for me was when I was told I had to look for my part in every situation. Now, it was helpful that my sponsor explained to me that this was not a 100% or 100%. This was my part. And she said, even if your part is only 20%, and the rest of 80% is the other person. And it was really hard for me. I wish that I had had the format that we have in the Alpha series, because now it is extremely helpful. You've talked about the trip in, but the one that I find is more powerful in doing this for me is the Solomon syndrome. Because my part now in using Alpha terminology, my part in the vast majority of the things that I hated people for was that I had my worth attached to them. And it really stood out for me after I understood Alpha terminology, when I went back to my big book, and on the bottom of page 64, it says, in most cases, we found that our self-esteem Well, hello, that's self-worth. That's straight out of the Solomon syndrome. Had been hurt. And it goes into great detail in explaining our favorite gods and how. So, my part, and the part that I was able to get a real good hold of in forgiving and giving up some of those resentments, was that I had my worth attached to them. They failed me. They were never intended to succeed anyway. That wasn't that person's fault. My part was expecting them to meet my need for security and significance. And they failed me. And once I understood, they were set up to fail. They were never intended for that. Then it helped so much.
That's great insight, ma'am. Thank you. David, dealing with hatred.
So walking into doors of recovery 30-something years ago, I had absolutely no identity. So I was so deep in addiction and with what was going on in my life, I didn't have any worse. So I didn't think I had the right to be resentful at anybody. This is just how deep my learning who I was opened up my mind, and I started understanding that I hated everybody. And so the process that I learned from the Alpha series is the fact that we do immediately go from anger to hate. So I have used that as a practice in my daily life to try to deal with it. Take it to the Lord, ask Him to forgive me for my part, which is hating the person, and to give me the ability to forgive. For me, as the book says, AA book says, resentments are the number one, and I truly see that in my life. So that's what led to my falls, my failures, recovery. I know that it's resentment that's the one that traps me. So that's something I practice on a daily basis because it's very real in my life, because I don't know why, but as maybe it's because I'm an alcoholic, maybe it's just my character, my person, but I get offended easy. I don't know if that's true of every alcoholic, but it's true of me. So that's one I have to practice regularly, or I will hate. Thank you.
Yeah, by regular, you're talking about daily. I do too. Tom, how are you dealing with hate?
Well, speaking of recovering heresy, you know that a good Christian doesn't hate anybody. So you believe me, don't you? Yeah. The way I dealt with hate was to deny it even existed and to stuff it down. But the problem is that the more I stuff down, the more the pressure build up, and sooner or later she's got to blow. And often what would happen is it would the event that caused me to blow was actually could be right out of a small event, just a little pinprick. And if you got all that pressure built up, it's going to blow. So whoever was there to see it blow, was subjected to a very ugly experience. Often that would be my wife's, and she would actually get to where she would call at work and ask what kind of mood I was in, late in the afternoon, so she would know what to expect when I got home, whether it was Mr. Wonderful or, it was Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Yeah, so that had to stop. As far as the person I hated the most as a result of doing an inventory, as it turned out, was myself. So I can really identify with what old King Solomon was talking about in Ecclesiastes 2:17, where his conclusion was, so I hated life. It's kind of like what David was saying. I hated everybody, but I was at the top of the list. So that had to change, but it was a difficult thing for a Pharisee to admit, because good Christians, we don't want to be guilty of breaking one of the 10 commandments, you know. And Jesus said, if you're angry with your brother, you've killed him already. If you hate your brother, you've killed him already. So I'll kick it back to one of you guys with that thought in mind.
Well, I'm glad that being a good Christian and all, you don't hate anybody. That's good for me to know, anyhow. Living close to.
Yeah.
I think we're all, denial is used, and primary symptom of our need for recovery. So that's good. Bill, why don't you wrap it up for us?
All right. Yeah, I can tell you something from both ends of that. One from a counseling end of it. But once I understood that that was not who I was, for a while, I was like really recognizing the hatred. And there's this sick thing in me, like if people, like especially with family members, my kids, not so much Carrie, because I don't know, it was fine that we had different opinions and things. The kids, if they don't think like me, if they don't adopt my values, then they've rejected me. I hate them. Your own kids, they're rejecting me. They're not loving me. They're not loving God. They've rejected my values. So that was something that, it was easy for me to recognize it and go straight to the Lord with it and tell him. And why I would tell God I'm hating this, that, and the other, this person or that person. There was this transaction that would occur when I would do that. God would show me that that I really didn't hate them, that the new person that I was loved them and cared for them, and that this was the flesh, and he would separate me from my flesh, deal with it, and move me forward. But I noticed that there's this great dependency that we have on the Lord for that. We have to depend on the Lord moment by moment and really be honest. And I noticed that one of the hard things is that, like Tom said, that I think that's the reason when I was first challenged to do the resentment list, I don't resent anybody. I'm a Christian. You're supposed to love everybody. And then you kind of deny the hatred, but face to face with the people, you have this like syrupy, sweet nonsense going on that isn't true. Bless your heart, that type of stuff, But I noticed that being honest with God, because of the separation between the flesh and the spirit, and God would come through every time. He would set me free. But anytime I'd get away from that and just say I'm angry, or here's the two things we do, especially as Christians. We deny it, or we beat ourselves up for it, or we have to prove and justify what a worthless person that is and how you have every right to be angry because you're a victim, yada, yada, yada. So I really think that being honest with God and really no King James English, walking in the light. I remember I talked to you, John, once. I said, I was mad at somebody, and I said I was out, and I taught how I cussed them out one side, the other, yelled and screaming at God. And you said that's walking in the light. Being honest about your flesh is walking in the light as He is in the light. We have fellowship with one another, true, genuine fellowship. When you talked about people denying it, it's hard because I think that it is such a strong word, but it's the opposite of love, and we're supposed to love, and that's why we get so caught up on that. But look at the country; it's caught up in this hate cycle right now that is destructive. And Paul said, if you do that, you'll bite and devour one another. But I remember counseling a young lady. Her family asked me to counsel her for her depression, and I remember they wanted me to go to the house, and I said no. I said have her come to the office. Just her taking a shower and getting dressed and doing all that, But anyway, so as we counsel, one of the situations with this young lady was her whole family rejected her, and unfairly they rejected her for who she chose to marry, and she married interracially, and the whole family like rejected her. So around the holidays, because the older brother was the big hero in the family, around the holidays, her depression and all that would pick up. So he rejected her brother, not only rejected her, but rejected her kids. So I said to her, I said, oh, I got it. I said, I understand. You hate your brother, you know? And you could see just in her body language that this strong overmotion overtook her, and I can tell she was trying to deal with it. And I said, I'd hate him. You know, you reject me, yeah, that hurts, but you reject my kids, I'm really going to hate you. You know, you're hating your brother. And like that, you could see the anger rise up to almost, you know how people get that little anger bump in the middle of their head? I mean, that her face literally changed, and she's so mad, pushed it down, kind of shook her head and smiled and said, I don't hate anybody. I pray for him. I pray for him. So I was like, whoa. I said, you sure? I said, I would definitely. So I kind of backed off of that. And the next week, she met a guy. So now she was happy. Everything was great. There's always a guy. She meets a guy, and then counseling dropped off. Well, the next call that I got from the family was to officiate her funeral. She had drunk herself to death, because she would pull the shades when she'd get depressed and all that. And she drank herself and was alone, like was in the 17 days. You know, the family couldn't, like, they were used to her just isolating like that. And the thing that I really reassured everybody was that she didn't die alone. You know, Christ was with her. But that was just showed me the destruction and the denial, because this person was a very sweet, kind-hearted person, but didn't know how to deal with, could not cope because of the religious conditioning, could not cope, was not able to admit that hatred that was kind of eaten away. And if you know, look at the Psalms. I mean, you have people asking God to go bash the brains out of infants. I mean, that's how raw the hatred was. And that's recorded in the Psalms. It's not God saying that he wants to do that or wants us to do it. It's recorded there to see how we can bring our raw hatred to God, and then he's going to cause it to work for the good and us able to love one another. So it's honesty is the first part of that. And don't tell the person that you're hating, especially if it's your wife or your child, because it's not you really that's hating them. Take it to the Lord, and he'll sort it all out. He is our wonderful counselor. The Holy Spirit is your wonderful counselor. I'll throw it back to you, John.
All right, I appreciate that anecdote about the danger of hatred. And I think this is one of the main reasons why the fourth step is so important in any type of recovery, is to deal with those resentments, that root of bitterness that the writer of Hebrews talks about, that springs up and defiles many, not just the individual who is suffering from it, but also through their relationships. So I encourage you. I thank you guys. I want to thank the panel for being here tonight, and encourage you all to continue your study of recovery on the fourth step. Will you close it out, Bill?
Yeah, we'll look at who's out there. We'll say hi to everybody.
Yeah.
Got people from all over. Someone from Ohio, right in your backyard. The Cass clan is watching from Jensen Beach. This is somebody new. Bugs Are Me. Maybe it's an exterminator.
Patrick Zent, my cousin. Yeah.
Yeah, Patrick's out there. Where, in Colorado?
Right.
Good. Dar, Rodney. Who are these people? Dave and Mary.
Dave and Mary. I know them. Hey, Dave.
So we got a good group of people out there. Hey, you know her, right, John?
Yeah, she'll be correcting me as soon as I get home.
Texas. Yeah. So next week we'll be going. Next week we'll be doing the step 5, right?
Right.
We'll be doing step 5, and then Dave's back. We'll be doing step 5. This Thursday night we're still doing the relational empowerment class. We're going to be talking about breaking out of the hate cycle and communication and things like that. Tom and I are doing, but we'll bring the panel on as well. And Sunday, you've been up and running pretty much back to the regular schedule, right, John?
Yeah, we're doing good. Yeah, so
I know the folks at Reach Community Church just kind of watch the website and watch the dates and announcements on Facebook, because it's kind of all depends on the weather right now, whether they're going to meet or not. We should all do like just have everyone wad up at the ranch. We have cover there. You know, one Sunday, everyone should just get together out there, have a big reunion. So that's about it on the announcement side. I really tonight really helped me. Probably God teaching me right where I'm at. Right, we teach ourselves all too often. So I want to say good night to everybody, and thanks for joining us. And just keep an eye on the website, keep an eye on the Facebook for coming up, because Tom and I, John, we've been talking about doing a little grace nugget, little live stream segment. And thanks to David, Tom, Pam, John.
Thank you all.
For a very enlightening discussion. Good night, all.